Harlem, New York. 1:47 p.m. Saturday, September 18th, 1965. The afternoon heat pressed against the windows of Ristorante Palazzo like a debt collector's hand. Inside, the air conditioning hummed with the efficiency of European engineering, keeping the dining room at a precise 68 degrees while outside, 125th Street baked under an unforgiving sun. The restaurant occupied the corner of Lenox Avenue and 125th Street, its mahogany-paneled walls lined with oil paintings of Tuscan landscapes and Venetian canals, images designed to transport wealthy patrons far from the reality of Harlem, just beyond the tinted glass. Vincent Vinnie Torino stood behind the maitre de stand, a man whose tailored suit and slicked-back hair couldn't quite mask the Brooklyn accent that leaked through his practiced continental vowels. At 43, he had spent 8 years building Palazzo into Harlem's most exclusive dining establishment, serving senators, Broadway producers, and real estate magnates who wanted the thrill of dining uptown without the discomfort of integration. His clientele was curated with surgical precision. White, wealthy, and willing to pay premium prices for the privilege of exclusivity in a black neighborhood. The lunch crowd was winding down when Mame Johnson stepped through the brass-framed entrance. She wore a charcoal wool dress with pearl buttons, her posture erect, her movements carrying the quiet authority of Harlem royalty. She had made a reservation 3 days prior under her own name. A test, perhaps, or simply the expectation that respect would be shown where respect was due. The hostess, a blonde woman named Patricia with lips, painted the color of fresh blood, looked down at the reservation book, then up at Mamie's face, then back at the book. The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds that would cost Vincent Torino everything he had built over nearly a decade. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, her voice carrying the rehearsed tone of practiced discrimination. "We seem to have overbooked. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments on 125th Street. The other diners, 7 tables of white faces above expensive suits, had stopped their conversations. Forks hovered over plates of osso buco and veal marsala. The entire restaurant had become a theater, and Mame Johnson stood center stage, alone. Vincent emerged from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel. He looked at Mame the way a man looks at a problem that needs solving. "Madame," he said, his voice carrying traces of an accent that was part Italian, part performance. "This establishment maintains certain standards. Reservations can be complicated. I'm sure you understand. It wasn't just refusal. It was calculated humiliation. Public. Witnessed. Designed to send a message that even the wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson could be dismissed, diminished, made to feel small in her own neighborhood. Mame didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned and walked back into the September heat, where the temperature had climbed to 86 degrees, and the smell of bus exhaust mingled with the distant sound of children playing in Marcus Garvey Park. By 2:15 p.m., word had reached the corner of 7th and 147th Street, where Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of a social club, studying a chess position while Lucky Strike smoke curled toward the ceiling. The messenger was a teenager named Marcus, who delivered the news in breathless fragments. "Mr. Johnson." They turned Miss Mame away, called her out her name. At that Italian place on 125th, Bumpy didn't look up from the chessboard. He moved a knight with deliberate precision, then checked his watch. 2:17 p.m. 72 hours, he said quietly. "I want Vincent Torino to understand exactly what he just cost himself. Every supplier, every vendor, every license, every protection. Everything." He stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at Harlem, his Harlem, stretching in all directions under the afternoon sun. By Tuesday evening, Ristorante Palazzo will be a memory. and Vincent Torino will understand that disrespect carries compound interest. 72 hours later, the restaurant would be dark, its owner broken, and Harlem would remember once again that certain insults carried consequences no insurance policy could cover. The story of how Vincent Torino lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to Saturday, September 18th, 1965. Vincent Torino arrived in Harlem in 1957 with borrowed money and the particular arrogance of a second-generation Italian-American who believed his bloodline granted him territorial rights. His father had operated a modest grocery in Brooklyn's Bensonhurst for 40 years, serving the same families, making the same small profit, dying with the same small debt. Vincent wanted something different. He looked at Harlem not as a vibrant community experiencing the tremors of civil rights awakening, but as a balance sheet waiting to be optimized. Prime real estate selling at Depression-era prices because white flight had created opportunity for anyone willing to stake a claim on the margins. The backing came from downtown investors who understood the mathematics of segregation. A high-end restaurant in Harlem could charge Manhattan prices while paying Harlem rent. The protection came through monthly cash envelopes delivered to Sal Martinelli, who collected tribute from 40 establishments between 110th and 145th Street on behalf of the Genovese family. In exchange, Vincent received something more valuable than physical security. He received permission to operate according to his own rules, free from interference by neighborhood leaders who might object to his customer selection process. Ristorante Palazzo operated on a binary system of entry that functioned with bureaucratic precision. For white clientele, there was the brass-framed entrance on Lenox Avenue, guarded by velvet rope and Patricia's practiced smile. For black residents who wanted to taste Vincent's veal marsala, there was a steel door in the alleyway next to the dumpster, where takeout orders were dispensed in brown paper bags. The segregation wasn't accidental. It was architectural. Black customers who called for reservations heard Patricia's voice shift into polite obstruction. Tables were perpetually booked for requested times, though availability somehow existed 30 minutes earlier or 2 hours later at deliberately inconvenient moments. Walk-ins encountered dress code requirements that appeared nowhere in writing but materialized instantly against skin color while remaining technically race-neutral. This was 1965 Harlem, 1 year after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act with cameras recording every stroke. Legal integration had arrived on paper, celebrated by white liberals as the end of American apartheid. The reality on 125th Street told a different story. Laws changed overnight. Culture changed across generations. The space between legislation and implementation became a battlefield where old practices wore new disguises. Restaurants couldn't legally refuse service based on race, so they refused based on reservation availability, dress codes, and mysterious capacity calculations that somehow always reached maximum occupancy when black faces appeared. 3 days before that Saturday afternoon, Mame Johnson had called from her living room at 2:00 p.m. Wednesday. Patricia answered on the third ring, her voice carrying practiced warmth until Mame requested a table for Saturday at 2:00 p.m. The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds before Patricia asked for the name. When Mame said Johnson, Patricia's voice shifted into cautious formality. She placed the reservation in the book, confirmed the details, and ended the call with manufactured courtesy that felt like a door closing softly but completely. Vincent reviewed every reservation personally each morning. When he saw Johnson at 2 p.m. Saturday, he made his decision. This reservation would be honored with technical precision. Mame Johnson would be allowed to arrive, to state her name, to stand in the dining room surrounded by white faces. Then she would be turned away with an explanation designed for maximum humiliation, delivered loudly enough for witnesses, politely enough to avoid legal liability. When Mame walked through that entrance Saturday afternoon, she carried herself with dignity earned through decades in a world that measured her worth by her husband's reputation. Vincent's performance was calculated theater. Patricia checking the reservation book. Vincent emerging from the kitchen with his white towel and practiced accent. The suggestion that she would be more comfortable elsewhere, delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. 7 tables of white faces observing a black woman being put in her place. In the back corner, 63-year-old busboy Samuel recognized Mame's face from church services and neighborhood gatherings. He watched Vincent's performance with resigned understanding, but Samuel knew something Vincent didn't. He knew exactly whose wife had just been humiliated. Disrespecting Mame Johnson wasn't customer service. It was a declaration of war. Marcus was 14 and fast enough to run messages across Harlem for dollar bills and proximity to power. Samuel caught him outside at 2:05 p.m. and spoke 3 sentences. By 2:15 p.m., Marcus burst through the door at 7th and 147th, breathless and sweating. The insult had transformed during his sprint, magnified into something that demanded response, required vengeance, could not be allowed to stand without consequences that would restore balance to a neighborhood watching, to see if respect still meant anything in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson set down his coffee cup at 2:23 p.m. and reached for the black rotary phone mounted on the wall beside the window. The chess pieces had been cleared away, but the board remained, its checkered surface reflecting the afternoon light that filtered through Venetian blinds. Marcus had delivered his message and departed with a folded $5 bill, leaving behind the kind of silence that precedes systematic destruction. Bumpy's first call went to Raymond Williams, a man whose authority over Teamsters Local 237 could make deliveries appear or vanish across Upper Manhattan with the efficiency of a traffic light changing colors. The conversation lasted exactly 47 seconds. Bumpy explained that Vincent Torino at Ristorante Palazzo had created a situation requiring correction through economic pressure rather than physical violence. Ray understood immediately. By 2:35 p.m., 3 additional calls had been placed to men whose cooperation kept restaurants operational across Harlem. Union stewards who controlled truck routes, city clerks who processed health inspection schedules, liquor distributors who decided which establishments received priority service. Each conversation ended with the same instruction. Nothing violent, nothing traceable. Just the quiet withdrawal of services that Vincent had assumed were permanent fixtures of his business infrastructure. While Bumpy orchestrated the economic siege, his lieutenant Theodore Mason began compiling intelligence with the methodical precision of a military operation. Teddy had spent 6 years working collections for Metropolitan Finance before the work became too legitimate for his expanding ambitions. He understood debt structures, supply chain vulnerabilities, and the hidden pressure points that kept businesses functioning. By 4 p.m., Teddy had contacted 4 individuals who worked in various capacities around Palazzo, each conversation adding crucial detail to the dossier that would become Vincent's blueprint for destruction. The intelligence revealed systematic weakness throughout Vincent's operation. His produce arrived from Giordano Brothers on 106th Street, a family business that had supplied restaurants in East Harlem for 23 years. Fresh seafood came twice weekly from Atlantic Wholesale, operated by the Castellano family but dependent on Teamsters drivers for delivery schedules. Bread arrived daily from Lombardi Bakery, which had held the Palazzo contract since opening day. The liquor distributor was Empire Spirits, maintaining contracts with 42 restaurants, but vulnerable to route cancellations and union pressure. Linen service came from Prestige Cleaners, owned by a man named Morris Klein, who owed Bumpy's associate Jimmy $3,000 and several unspecified favors dating back to 1962. Every vendor operated trucks that traveled through territories where Bumpy's influence ran deeper than Vincent's monthly protection payments to Sal Martinelli. The Genovese family collected tribute, but provided no operational protection against economic warfare waged by neighborhood powers. Vincent had purchased physical security while leaving his supply chain completely exposed to systematic disruption. The financial assessment revealed even more dangerous vulnerabilities. Vincent owed $38,000 to Carmine Battaglia, a loan shark who operated from a social club on Mulberry Street. The debt carried compound interest that had been bleeding the restaurant's cash flow for 18 months, originally borrowed to cover renovation costs when Palazzo expanded its dining room in 1963. Vincent made payments religiously, but the principal barely decreased while interest accumulated. His liquor license required renewal in exactly 4 weeks, a bureaucratic process involving city inspectors, health department approval, and administrative cooperation that could be delayed indefinitely through strategic phone calls to the right offices. Bumpy studied the completed dossier at 6 p.m., while 3 associates waited for instructions. The room was silent except for pages turning and ice settling in glasses of bourbon that remained untouched. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold precision of a surgeon describing a necessary amputation. He wanted economic warfare, not physical violence. Vincent would lose everything slowly, watching each piece of his world fall away, understanding exactly why his business was collapsing, but remaining powerless to stop the cascade of destruction. The punishment would be educational, demonstrating that disrespect carried compound interest calculated across every business relationship Vincent had built over 8 years of operation. The first move occurred at 7:30 p.m., when Bumpy walked into Carmine Battaglia's social club carrying a leather briefcase containing $42,000 in cash. Carmine was playing poker with 3 men who went silent when Bumpy entered, their cards frozen halfway to the table. The negotiation lasted 12 minutes and concluded with Carmine accepting $4,000 above the principal debt, making him whole plus profit for the administrative inconvenience. The loan documents transferred ownership immediately. Vincent Torino now owed Bumpy Johnson $38,000, due on demand, with consequences that extended far beyond financial penalties into territories where collection methods were not constrained by legal precedent. Between 8 p.m. and midnight, conversations occurred with every vendor in Vincent's supply chain. The message was delivered with polite clarity by men who understood the economics of choosing sides in neighborhood disputes. You can do business with Vincent Torino, or you can do business in Harlem. The choice is yours, but you cannot maintain both relationships simultaneously. Most vendors decided immediately after reviewing their customer lists and calculating the mathematics of loyalty versus survival. A few requested until midnight to consider their options. By 12:30 a.m. Sunday, every major supplier had made the same choice, prioritizing their broader Harlem business over a single restaurant contract. The psychological pressure was delivered through a smaller gesture designed to induce paranoia before the economic hammer fell completely. At 11:47 p.m. Saturday, a delivery man knocked on the service entrance of Ristorante Palazzo. Patricia answered, finding a single red rose wrapped in black tissue paper. The card attached contained only 2 words written in elegant script. For Patricia. No signature, no explanation, no return address. Just the quiet message that even the staff were being watched. Their names documented, their participation in Vincent's humiliation noted and remembered by people who operated beyond the reach of police protection or legal remedy. Sunday morning arrived with September sunshine and the promise of systematic destruction. Vincent pulled his Cadillac into the alley behind Palazzo at 6:30 a.m., expecting the usual deliveries that prepared the restaurant for weekend lunch service. The loading dock stretched empty under cloudless sky. No produce truck idling with engine running. No seafood delivery with ice-packed crates. No bread van from Lombardi's with the Sunday order of fresh rolls and focaccia. He checked his watch, assuming minor delays were causing the unusual silence. At 6:45 a.m., Vincent walked to his office and dialed Giordano Produce, irritation already forming into the beginning of panic. The phone rang 4 times before a voice he didn't recognize answered with mechanical flatness. Vincent identified himself and demanded to know the status of his morning delivery. The response came without hesitation, without apology, without explanation. "We can't service your location anymore." The line went dead before Vincent could ask why, leaving him staring at the receiver while understanding began to crystallize into the recognition that his world had fundamentally changed overnight. Sunday morning at 6:45 a.m., Vincent's first call went to Giordano Produce, where a voice he didn't recognize answered with mechanical flatness. When Vincent identified himself and demanded the status of his morning delivery, the response came without hesitation. "We can't service your location anymore." The line went dead before he could ask why. Atlantic Wholesale Seafood offered a more elaborate fiction about unexpected supply chain disruptions affecting restaurant deliveries indefinitely. Lombardi Bakery cited staffing shortages that somehow made Vincent's route impossible while maintaining service to 43 other establishments. By 9:00 a.m., 17 phone calls had produced the same result with minor variations in wording, each excuse polished and rehearsed, delivered with apologetic tones that couldn't mask the finality underneath. Empire Spirits didn't answer at all, their phones ringing into silence that felt more deliberate than any spoken refusal. Desperation drove Vincent to send his sous chef and 2 busboys to 3 different supermarkets with cash and instructions to buy whatever they could find. They returned with bags of wilted lettuce, frozen shrimp that would turn rubbery when cooked, and supermarket bread lacking the crust his clientele expected. Food costs tripled overnight, while quality plummeted to diner standards. The lunch service began at noon, with customers expecting excellence and receiving competent mediocrity. Table 7 sent back the veal marsala after 3 bites, complaining the meat was tough and lacked complexity. Mrs. Vanderbilt, whose patronage had anchored Tuesday nights for 4 years, pushed away her salad after finding the tomatoes mealy and tasteless. At 1:30 p.m., a couple at table 4 stood up, left their half-eaten $63 meal unpaid, and told Patricia the quality had fallen off a cliff, while other diners observed the confrontation with the attention that precedes negative word of mouth, spreading faster than any advertising campaign could. Counter. Monday brought escalation, rather than relief. Empire Spirits called at 8:15 a.m. with news of immediate contract cancellation due to corporate restructuring, severing the liquor supply that generated 40% of Palazzo's profit margin. Prestige Cleaners failed to deliver Monday linen service, forcing waiters to reuse stained tablecloths turned inside out to hide yesterday's spills. The flower vendor who had delivered fresh arrangements every Monday for 6 years simply vanished, leaving empty vases on every table that emphasized absence rather than elegance. Each failure arrived with precise timing, as though orchestrated by an invisible conductor whose baton moved unseen but whose music was deafening. At 3 p.m., Carmine Battaglia entered with 2 associates whose tailored suits couldn't disguise the menace radiating from their posture. He placed loan documents on the maître de stand, papers now bearing a transfer stamp dated Saturday night. The debt has been sold, Carmine announced with the finality of a judge's gavel. $38,000. 10 days. Full payment. He walked out before Vincent could ask who held the paper, though the answer was already crystallizing in his stomach like a stone. Staff loyalty disintegrated within hours. 2 waiters collected their tips after the disastrous lunch service and never returned. The sommelier cornered Vincent in his office, demanding weekly salary in cash, in advance, before uncorking another bottle. Patricia spent her break circling newspaper ads and making calls from the hallway payphone. Her practiced smile replaced by quiet desperation as she abandoned the sinking vessel. Wednesday afternoon, Vincent hired private investigator Frank Miller, paying $500 for answers about who was orchestrating the boycott. Miller returned 4 hours later, pale and shaken, placing the money back on Vincent's desk. "I made 3 calls," he said, voice low as if the walls were listening. "The first 2 hung up when I mentioned your name. The third gave me advice I'm passing to you for free. Leave town tonight. Don't pack. Just go." Miller disappeared into the Harlem night like he was fleeing contagion. Midnight found Vincent sitting alone in his empty dining room, air-conditioning cooling tables with no flowers, no clean linens, no reservations for tomorrow. The silence carried weight that pressed against his chest like accumulated debt. Every severed relationship, every cancelled contract, every missing delivery had happened simultaneously within a 72-hour window. This wasn't market forces or coincidental business failures. This was orchestrated destruction, systematic and personal, designed to teach lessons about respect and consequences. He had humiliated Mame Johnson on Saturday afternoon. By Wednesday midnight, he understood with terrifying clarity that he was fighting a war he had already lost before he even knew the battle had begun. Monday morning found Vincent Torino behind the wheel of a rented delivery truck, crossing the George Washington Bridge into New Jersey territory, where Harlem's invisible blockade couldn't reach. The suppliers in Newark and Hoboken sensed desperation like predators smell wounded prey. Produce that normally cost $60 per crate now carried a $180 price tag. Fresh seafood required payment in advance by wire transfer at triple the standard rate. Vincent bled $4,000 in 3 hours, securing enough supplies to operate for 72 hours while his cash reserves evaporated into simple survival mathematics. He returned to 125th Street exhausted, unloading crates himself because half his kitchen staff had abandoned ship, leaving him with 3 terrified loyalists too frightened to quit but too nervous to help with heavy lifting. At exactly 6 p.m. Monday, 20 men in tailored suits materialized on the sidewalk outside Ristorante Palazzo like a military unit deploying for siege warfare. They didn't arrive together in any formation that would attract police attention. Instead, they appeared in pairs and small groups over 10 minutes, taking positions along the block with surgical precision. Dark wool suits, polished leather shoes, conservative ties, fedoras angled with identical authority. No weapons visible, no voices raised, no laws technically broken. They didn't block the brass-framed entrance physically, but their presence created a psychological barrier more effective than any locked door or velvet rope. Potential customers approaching the restaurant saw them first, not the gold lettering announcing fine dining. Couples slowed their pace, read the silent menace in 20 pairs of eyes, and chose dinner elsewhere without explanation. A Lincoln Continental pulled to the curb, disgorged a wealthy couple who took one look at the assembled men, immediately returned to their vehicle, and departed with tires squealing against asphalt. Vincent called the 28th Precinct at 6:23 p.m. his voice shaking as he reported business interference and intimidation. 2 patrol officers arrived 14 minutes later, emerging from their cruiser with the weary recognition of men who already understood this situation exceeded their authority. The senior officer recognized Theodore Mason immediately, then spotted Raymond Williams, then identified 3 other faces connected to operations that existed in the gray space between legitimate business and organized crime. They spoke briefly with the assembled men, who smiled politely and gestured to the open sidewalk with the courtesy of law. The Sugar Bowl occupied a corner on 145th Street, where fluorescent lights hummed above formica tables, and the air carried decades of accumulated grease mixed with burnt coffee. Vincent Torino arrived at 7:58 p.m., 2 minutes early but centuries behind the timeline that had already sealed his fate. Sweat darkened his collar, despite the cool September evening that had dropped to 64 degrees, and his hands trembled as he scanned the modest interior. 3 tables held neighborhood residents eating dinner with studied disinterest, but Vincent recognized the careful attention underneath, understanding he was performing for an audience that would report every detail to Harlem's network of watchers. Bumpy Johnson sat at the rear table facing the entrance, a chessboard positioned between his coffee cup and a half-eaten slice of sweet potato pie. The pieces showed white technically ahead in material, but fatally compromised in position. Black knight advanced to f6 in attacking formation. Bumpy didn't look up when Vincent approached, studying the board with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a failed specimen. When he finally raised his eyes, they carried no anger, which proved infinitely more terrifying than rage. Anger implied loss of control. This was surgical precision. Vincent pulled out the chrome-edged chair, metal legs scraping linoleum, with amplified sound in the quiet restaurant. A waitress appeared instantly, refilling Bumpy's coffee and offering Vincent nothing, not even water. The message was clear. He wasn't a customer. He was a defendant. Bumpy moved a white pawn forward 2 squares with deliberate slowness, then spoke in a voice low enough that Vincent had to lean forward slightly. He explained the economics of respect with accounting precision, breaking down 8 years of systematic theft disguised as business standards. Vincent had built his fortune on Harlem money, employed Harlem workers at minimum wage, extracted wealth from the community, then treated Bumpy's wife like she was invisible when she requested the simple dignity of a reserved table. That wasn't just disrespect, Bumpy explained while capturing a white piece. That was robbery wearing the mask of customer service, systematic extraction of resources while denying basic humanity to the people who made those profits possible. The philosophical lecture concluded with brutal mathematics. Vincent owed $38,000 to debt that Bumpy now owned. His supply chain was destroyed beyond reconstruction, every vendor relationship severed permanently. His staff had abandoned ship, sensing instability like rats fleeing floodwater. His customer base had evaporated as word spread through Manhattan's dining circles that Palazzo was toxic, marked for destruction by forces beyond Vincent's capacity to resist. He was technically bankrupt, just hadn't filed the papers yet. Bumpy presented 2 choices with the finality of a judge delivering sentence. First option: sign over Ristorante Palazzo for exactly $1. Leave Harlem tonight. Never return to any territory north of 110th Street. The debt would be forgiven as part of the transaction. Vincent would walk away broke but breathing, free to rebuild somewhere his name didn't carry the stain of this week's education. Second option: keep the restaurant but surrender operational control to Bumpy's management. Vincent would become an employee in his own establishment, watching other men make decisions, serve customers he had previously excluded, drawing a salary determined by his new employer's generosity, while being reminded daily of his defeat. Vincent's mind performed calculations with desperate speed, reviewing his impossible position like a drowning man seeing his life compressed into seconds. The debt alone would crush him. The supply chain would never recover. The customers would never return under his name. The 20 men who had stood outside his restaurant would return tomorrow and every day after. He had no allies willing to confront Bumpy Johnson over a restaurant dispute. Keeping the restaurant meant permanent subjugation, daily reminders of failure, watching Bumpy's lieutenants serve black customers at tables Vincent had reserved for white faces. The decision calcified in his chest like a tumor that had been growing since Saturday afternoon when he made Mame Johnson accept public humiliation. Selling meant exile but preserved some fragment of dignity through clean separation rather than prolonged torture. Vincent's voice emerged barely above a whisper when he accepted the first option, agreeing to sell for $1 and disappear from Harlem like he had never existed. Bumpy reached into his leather satchel and produced legal documents already prepared by attorneys who had anticipated this exact outcome. A notary emerged from the back kitchen, wiping his hands on a napkin, carrying stamp and ink pad. He had been waiting for this moment, just like everyone else in the room. Vincent signed with a hand that shook so violently the pen nearly tore through paper, watching 8 years of work transfer ownership in the time it took to write his name 3 times. The notary applied his stamp with bureaucratic precision, collected his fee in cash from Bumpy, and departed without speaking. Bumpy placed a single crisp dollar bill on the table between the coffee cup and chessboard. The transaction was complete. As Vincent stood on legs that felt disconnected from his body, desperate to escape into the September night, Bumpy's voice stopped him with words that carried more weight than any threat. "Patricia could keep her job if she wanted it," he said quietly, his tone almost conversational. Under new management, the restaurant would serve everyone with equal respect, regardless of skin color or neighborhood reputation. Vincent walked out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the coffee shop, the chessboard, and the life he had built on systematic disrespect. By morning, his exclusionary palace would be transformed into a space that honored the community he had exploited. And Patricia would learn that in Harlem, respect wasn't negotiable, and consequences arrived with compound interest calculated in losses that money couldn't measure. Wednesday morning arrived with September sunshine, filtering through the mahogany-paneled windows of what had been Vincent Torino's domain for 8 years. He entered at 8:00 a.m. Carrying 3 cardboard boxes purchased from a Broadway moving supply store, his hands still trembling from Tuesday night's capitulation. Theodore Mason and 2 associates were already present, conducting systematic inventory with clipboards and mechanical precision. They catalogued every bottle in the wine cellar, every piece of kitchen equipment, every oil painting that had decorated Vincent's vision of European elegance transplanted to Harlem soil. The transition occurred with corporate efficiency, no hostility in their voices, just administrative processing of assets changing ownership. Vincent packed his personal items in silence, while strangers documented everything he was leaving behind. By 10:15 a.m., he walked out the brass-framed entrance for the final time, carrying 30 pounds of memories that represented 8 years of systematic exclusion. The transformation began immediately, with workers arriving to remove the Ristorante Palazzo sign and replace it with hand-carved letters spelling Lennox Supper Club in elegant script that honored the neighborhood rather than pretending to transport diners across the Atlantic. The menu remained largely unchanged because the food had never been the problem. Veal marsala and osso buco would still be served with the same recipes, but now alongside collard greens, prepared by a chef who had learned from his grandmother in South Carolina. and cornbread that acknowledged Harlem's southern roots rather than pretending they didn't exist. Patricia received her reckoning on Thursday afternoon. Summoned to the office where Vincent once ruled, she expected termination. Instead, she received new instructions delivered by Raymond Williams. Her job was safe. Her salary increased by 20%, but her mandate had changed fundamentally. Every customer who walked through that brass-framed door received identical courtesy. Reservations were honored based on time, not race. The complications that had conveniently excluded black patrons were permanently resolved. She accepted the terms with visible relief, understanding that her survival depended on absolute compliance with the new order that valued integration over exclusivity. New staff arrived throughout the week. 4 black waiters with experience at downtown hotels were hired immediately, bringing professional polish that matched the restaurant's ambition. The kitchen brigade expanded to include local culinary talent, previously denied opportunity based on hiring practices that valued European surnames over expertise. The French sommelier stayed after a single conversation, recognizing that wine knowledge transcended race and that his expertise would be valued under any ownership that prioritized quality over prejudice. Saturday evening, exactly 1 week after Mame Johnson had been turned away, she returned on Bumpy's arm wearing a navy dress with pearl accessories. Patricia greeted them at the entrance with genuine warmth that wasn't performance but recognition of the new reality. She led them to the corner table with views of both Lenox Avenue and the dining room's interior, personally delivering menus while explaining the evening's specials with attention that bordered on reverence. Other diners watched the scene with understanding that this was public demonstration of the new order, confirmation that Harlem's first family could now dine in their own neighborhood, without suffering systematic racism disguised as reservation policy. Within 30 days, Lenox Supper Club achieved profitability that exceeded Palazzo's best months. Duke Ellington dined there on a Tuesday. Adam Clayton Powell brought visiting senators on a Thursday. The restaurant became a destination not despite its integration, but because of it, attracting progressive clientele who viewed equal service as a feature rather than a flaw. The reservation book, once a tool of exclusion, became a democratic record of Harlem's social hierarchy, where money and manners were the only currency that mattered. Vincent Torino resurfaced in Queens 3 months later, opening a modest pizzeria on a corner in Astoria, where ambitions were smaller and neighborhood politics less complex. He never attempted to operate in Manhattan again. Understanding that his story had become cautionary legend, whispered in restaurant industry backrooms. A man who forgot that hospitality requires humility and that insulting the wrong woman could cost more than just a bad review. The ripple effect spread quietly across 125th Street. Other white-owned businesses that had practiced subtle discrimination began adjusting their policies without announcements or fanfare. Reserved signs disappeared from tables. Service improved for black customers in clothing stores and pharmacies. The message had been received clearly. Discrimination was no longer just morally wrong. It was economically suicidal. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that the cost of disrespect could be calculated in bankruptcy filings, and no insurance policy covered that particular risk. 6 months later, on a warm April evening, Bumpy and Mame walked past the corner of Lenox and 125th. Through the plate glass window, they saw a dining room filled with motion and light. At a table near the front, a young black couple toasted with crystal glasses, while a white family at the next table studied dessert menus. Patricia moved between them with equal grace, her transformation complete. Bumpy squeezed Mame's hand gently as they continued walking, leaving behind a restaurant that had learned, through painful education, that respect wasn't something you gave when convenient. It was something you showed because it was right, and the tuition for forgetting that lesson was always Expensive, but the education was permanent. The autumn of 1965 found America suspended between legal promise and lived reality. A nation where the Civil Rights Act had celebrated its first birthday, but discrimination still thrived in the shadows between legislation and enforcement. In Selma, Alabama, marchers had crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge 6 months earlier, their blood staining concrete while television cameras broadcast the violence into living rooms across the country. In Washington, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in August, wielding pens like weapons against centuries of systematic disenfranchisement. But in Harlem, on the corner of Lenox and 125th Street, the gap between law and justice remained wide enough to swallow entire lives. Federal legislation could mandate equal access to public accommodations, but it couldn't force a restaurant owner to honor a reservation or prevent a hostess from claiming sudden capacity problems when black faces appeared at the entrance. Laws prohibited segregation, but custom enforced it with rigid efficiency. Restaurant owners like Vincent Torino found creative ways to circumvent compliance through reservation games, arbitrary dress codes, and vague references to standards that materialized instantly against skin color while remaining technically race-neutral. This space between legal protection and daily humiliation became Bumpy Johnson's jurisdiction, where street-level enforcement paralleled the legal battles occurring in courtrooms and congressional chambers hundreds of miles away. The economics of respect. What distinguished Bumpy's response to the Palazzo incident was its sophisticated understanding of power dynamics in the modern era. Violence was expensive, attracting police attention and federal investigation while producing temporary compliance built on fear that evaporated once the threat disappeared. Economic pressure, however, created permanent structural change by making discrimination unprofitable rather than merely dangerous. Bumpy had weaponized capitalism against racism, turning Vincent's greatest asset, his business relationships, into his primary vulnerability. The strategy functioned with brutal mathematical precision. When Vincent Torino lost his supply chain, his staff, his customers, and finally his business, the lesson extended far beyond one man's downfall. Every restaurant owner, every shopkeeper, every landlord operating in Harlem understood that exclusionary practices now carried calculable costs measured in bankruptcy filings rather than broken bones. The message was simple and devastating. If you humiliate black customers in Harlem, you will lose access to Harlem's economic ecosystem. Racism would carry an invoice with due on receipt terms and no option for installment plans. The transformation of Ristorante Palazzo into Lenox Supper Club demonstrated that integrated businesses could achieve greater profitability than segregated ones, destroying the economic justification that had sustained discrimination as sound business practice. For decades, businesses had operated on the assumption that excluding black customers preserved an exclusive atmosphere that white patrons would pay premium prices to enjoy. Bumpy flipped that equation permanently, proving that equal service wasn't charity, but competitive advantage in a neighborhood where black dollars spent just as green as white ones. The ripple effect. The impact spread through Harlem's commercial districts, with the speed of reputation traveling through interconnected communities. Within 3 months of Vincent's exile to Queens, 17 businesses quietly adjusted their service policies without announcements or apologies. The beauty salon on 132nd Street that had previously claimed full appointment books when black women called suddenly discovered availability. The clothing store on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, where black customers had been followed by suspicious staff, retrained their employees in customer service that didn't assume criminality based on melanin content. The hardware store that had kept black patrons waiting while serving white customers first implemented a numerical ticket system that enforced first-come, first-served equality. None of these changes were attributed publicly to Bumpy's intervention, But every business owner understood the cautionary tale that Vincent Torino's story represented. The reserved signs that perpetually sat on prime tables in certain restaurants disappeared. Service in high-end establishments became noticeably more attentive to black customers. Business owners understood the subtext. You didn't need a visit from Bumpy Johnson to understand the new rules. Political connections and police payoffs offered no protection against organized community economic pressure. The moral complexity of Bumpy Johnson's role defied simple categorization into hero or villain narratives that dominated mainstream discourse about organized crime. He was simultaneously a numbers runner who profited from gambling addiction, a drug dealer who contributed to community destruction, and a neighborhood protector who enforced standards of respect that legal systems failed to defend. His methods were undeniably criminal: extortion, economic coercion, systematic intimidation, yet they achieved outcomes that aligned with civil rights principles being championed by legitimate activists. This paradox reflected the broader contradictions of 1960s America, where the legal system promised equality while courts moved with glacial slowness, and police departments often sided with segregationists over protesters. Technically a criminal operating outside the law, Bumpy functioned in this instance as a protector of dignity where legal institutions had failed. The police had dismissed Vincent's discriminatory practices as private business decisions. The courts would have required years of litigation to achieve what Bumpy accomplished in 72 hours. In this gap between constitutional rights and their enforcement, figures like Bumpy operated as extra-legal arbiters, using criminal infrastructure to defend community dignity when legitimate channels offered only bureaucratic delays and empty promises. The cost of arrogance. Vincent Torino's downfall serves as a permanent case study in the consequences of underestimating community power and the importance of respect. His mistake wasn't simply refusing service to a black woman. Discrimination remained commonplace despite federal legislation. His fatal error was the fundamental failure to understand the environment where he operated. He viewed Harlem merely as real estate and labor, failing to recognize the intricate web of relationships and power dynamics that defined the community. He believed his downtown backers and Italian protection money made him untouchable, underestimating the power of a man who played chess while others played checkers. Vincent had confused physical security with comprehensive protection, failing to understand that Bumpy's authority derived not from violence, but from systematic control over the economic relationships that kept businesses operational. His 8-year investment evaporated in 72 hours because he had built his empire on borrowed territory without recognizing that true authority in Harlem belonged to those who commanded community loyalty rather than downtown capital. His exile to a modest Queens pizzeria marked the end of an era where outsiders could exploit Harlem without engaging with its people, never again attempting to operate in Manhattan after learning that arrogance carried compound interest calculated in losses that bankruptcy courts couldn't discharge. The lasting impact. The story entered Harlem's oral history with the weight of parable, passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration. Grandmothers told it to teenagers working their first service jobs, emphasizing that respect was non-negotiable currency in community economics. Business owners referenced it when training staff, using Vincent's downfall as cautionary example of consequences that followed systematic disrespect. Bartenders repeated it to new hires. Elders told it on stoops. Young hustlers cited it as evidence that power respected power, not paperwork. The narrative evolved with each retelling, details shifting but core message remaining constant. In Harlem, dignity wasn't subject to negotiation, and those who forgot that lesson received education they couldn't afford but would never forget. For black residents, it functioned as both warning and reassurance. There were consequences for open disrespect, even when the police refused to see a crime. For business owners, It served as a cautionary tale that traveled far beyond 125th Street, illustrating that disrespecting black dollars could mean commercial execution. The broader message. In 1960s America, a gap existed between the promise of law and the reality of justice. The 14th Amendment promised equal protection. The Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, but enforcement remained inconsistent and penalties insufficient to deter systematic racism. Legal protections existed on paper while discrimination thrived in practice, creating a vacuum that figures like Bumpy Johnson filled with their own brand of order. Flawed, illegal, and undeniably effective. His approach raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between legality and morality, about whether criminal methods could serve righteous ends, about what happens when legal systems fail to protect the rights they theoretically guarantee. Bumpy never claimed moral innocence. He claimed authority, and in the Palazzo incident, he used that authority not to line his pockets, but to correct an insult and shift the local economics of discrimination permanently. He turned one man's arrogance into a permanent public lesson that transformed an entire neighborhood's commercial landscape. Years later, sitting in that same social club on 147th Street where Marcus had delivered news of Maine's humiliation, Bumpy explained his philosophy to a young associate who asked why he had destroyed Vincent's business rather than simply breaking his legs. The answer came with the measured cadence of a man who had spent decades navigating the space between violence and strategy, between immediate satisfaction and lasting impact. Respect isn't something you give when it's convenient. It's something you show because it's right. Anyone who forgets that lesson, I'm happy to teach them. The tuition is expensive, but the education is permanent.